Hello, this is Dr. Garrett Castleberry, Associate Professor and Program Director of Communication, Media, and Ethics at Mid-America Christian University. And I am here with our Creating Social Media Presence and Cultural Movements Strategic Interviewing Series. And we have with us this week a fantastic international guest who is joining us live. We finally synced up from Tanzania in the southeastern region of Africa. So we're building bridges overseas, and we're continuing to connect with guests in a special way. Sammy, thank you for joining us. This is Samuel Alwami, and yes. He works, as our students know, but perhaps other audiences don't. He is a kind of a career journalist with BBC Africa currently. He's worked in several different roles, several different organizations, and has a lot of life experience to draw on. But we're super excited to have him into this interview context, where we're going to share some student questions that they've pre-recorded for us, and we want to engage those with the speaker, be able to learn about how he practices life and his professional roles. And we're blessed to have him on with us in this course. So, Sammy, if you will, take a moment, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came into the role you currently occupy.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Professor Castleberry, for inviting me to speak to your students. It's something that I quite like, actually. I like sharing my experiences in journalism with students, upcoming journalists, or journalists in their early careers. So thank you very much for inviting me. You've said already most of about me, but basically I've been in journalism now for about 14 years. I started, it's 14 years. I started in 2006. It was right about at the time when we met, I think we met in 2006, 2007, around that time. Yeah. So, and I've continued practicing journalism to date. And like you said, I've worked for so many organizations and different kinds of organizations. I've worked in broadcasting, I've worked in print media. So I started actually actively working as a journalist at a community radio stations. They are very popular here in Tanzania, and they help a lot with local communities. So I started there, but then I moved to work for a weekly newspaper, and then I got an opportunity to work for a daily newspaper. And then I took a career break, which was about 1 year, and I went for a fellowship in Canada, and I was at University of Toronto for a year. And while I was there, that's when I got this opportunity to work for the BBC here in Tanzania. So at the moment, I work for BBC Africa. And I am a bilingual correspondent. What that means is that I report for English and Swahili services. The BBC has so many languages that they report to, but for me, I report for English and Swahili services. What that means is that every time I go up to collect a story, I do in both languages, in Swahili and English. I'm primarily for Tanzania as a Tanzanian correspondent, but sometimes I get asked to go and help in other countries. I've been to Ethiopia, I've been to Uganda, Kenya, and just a couple months ago, I was, last month actually, I was in Malawi for elections and stuff. So even though I'm primarily for Tanzania, every now and then I'm asked to go in different countries to report. So yeah, I guess, and I report just about everything. I started mainly on human rights stories and good governance. I continue to report on that, but these days, since I joined the BBC, I get asked to report on just about everything except sports. I'm terrible with sports, unfortunately, but I report.
You are currently the only person in this conference.
All right. So I don't know if everyone was picking up on that. There was a little bit of a signal drop, right? Some catches there, and I didn't know if it was a signal issue or something in our connection. So hopefully, momentarily here, we'll be back connecting with Sammy, and he'll be able to continue in this interview. Certainly, anytime you're communicating overseas in a kind of international way, under unique circumstances, right, where we're all kind of facing a situation currently, at least, where many of us are working from home. These remote situations are not optimal because we perhaps lack the bandwidth, right, the technological durability to sustain those types of engagements, and so it can be quite common where people face disconnect. Well, this is an excellent learning opportunity, as a kind of potentially hope Sammy's able to rejoin us soon. But this is a great learning opportunity to talk about how this is a key difference between what professional news organizations are equipped to confront and really troubleshoot without delay, versus the kind of lay approaches to media production that we may face in a kind of home setting. And I just last night I was observing. I haven't been really taking in media late at night, at least nonfiction media, but I couldn't help but notice that the late night shows are continuing to air, and in that continuance, one of the programs had segments that were produced from home, right? So the host was shooting from home. It was very clear, kind of in a family den or home office, not unlike right now, and in fact, there were plenty of flaws, and I think this is one of these rare opportunities in television history where people are given access, rare ability to kind of break the fourth wall, so to speak, to kind of allow the wrinkles to show in a way, because as the old show business motto goes, the show must go on, right? And so we're seeing media production practices that are traditionally extremely fluid create other types of ways that to make that programming consistent. Because let's remember, television is an industry, as it sounds like Sammy's almost joining us again, but television is an industry, and so those media productions, those sort of corporate interests are significant. I think it's incredible that we've seen the professional sports world in so many ways fold quickly in response. Of course, the majority of them are public-based venues, so they have to kind of have that legal and more than ethical, but legal decision to blockade away from those fan bases that would come, that could be in harm's way. But other types of programming, right, news especially, but also maybe even talk shows and whatnot, they can continue. But what we're seeing with these continuous trends are viewers that irregular, non-traditional ways, right, which includes a lot of what we call like guerrilla approaches, right, to broadcasting, to programming, to content creation, and perhaps so it's an excellent learning opportunity if we're paying close attention to that, and it also gives us important case studies to realize there's so much human labor that goes on behind the scenes to make something like a news program or sporting event or whatever type of live-ish programming come across as smooth, come across as competent, come across as perfected, and we can recognize the invisible labor that goes on behind those scenes. Sammy, are you with us in audio form?
Yes, I'm with you with audio form.
Oh, this is great. All right. So we have you back, and I believe we had received most of that information about your background, your upbringing, and it's a fantastic way to hear your story. And I couldn't help but already selfishly come up with my own question as you were describing sometimes being called to cross borders to cover other stories. What you mentioned, Ethiopia, Malawi, and other countries and regions. Can you talk about the difference between can you describe the complexity between crossing borders in African nations versus perhaps like maybe the Western Europe or North America, and how that might be altered because you're representing you're sort of coming as a credentialed journalist versus maybe just a traveler?
Right. Well, it's interesting because even within Africa, countries are very different. Working environment between these countries are very different. There are a lot of countries in Africa which are very restrictive to journalists, and so one of the big challenges when crossing borders for as a journalist is government restrictions. A lot of governments in Africa, are not friendly to the press, so they would try to make your job as hard as possible. Whereas other countries are more progressive and they're easy and they're very accommodative and they're willing to help you. For instance, when I went to Ethiopia, it was quite difficult. I had to be very careful, for instance, with what I say, of course, I have to do my job properly. I have to be objective. I have to be, as professional as I can. But then I was aware of the fact that the government can be a bit ruthless and they can make my job difficult. It was difficult, for instance, even to get a visa to work in Ethiopia. I spent hours at the airport, just to get into the city to start working. Whereas when I went to Malawi, it was very different. Malawi government was very friendly. In fact, I got my visa within just a few minutes, and I was in the country. And then when it came to speaking to government officials, it was very easy. I could speak, for instance, to president's personal assistant very easily. There was an incident where I called the speaker of Malawi, and I couldn't find her, or she couldn't pick up my call, and she returned my call and asked me how she could help me. So it was very easy, because usually the government officials are more difficult to work with than, for instance, opposition leaders or activists or other civil society organizations. So probably one of the biggest challenges in Africa working in different countries is working with the government officials. They can make your entrance, even entering the country, difficult, but also cooperating, responding to your questions. They can also make that difficult as well.
No, that is excellent. And in fact, it's an excellent transition, because we have some student questions that relate to maybe some of the complexities or challenges that you just described. I'd love to be able to switch over and hear from some of our students and engage their questions. Let's start with a question from Kelsey, and I'll let it kind of play. And if you need clarification, just let me know, and I'll be able to provide that for us.
Hi, my name is Kelsey, and I have a couple questions for you. Can you describe some differences between producing journalism for radio versus print and television?
Okay, so you have some broad experience. Can you kind of compare and contrast the difference between approaching journalism with, as she said, maybe radio versus traditional, that sort of thing?
Right. So first of all, you have to remember that all these three are very different media. For instance, with newspaper, you are writing, you're producing a journalism piece for an year, Whereas for radio, for an eye, sorry, you're writing for someone to read. But for radio, for instance, you're producing for an ear, and for television, it's both. Someone has to be able to see good pictures and hear good quality, sound quality, and stuff like that. So with newspapers, in my experience, are much easier because if you can just get someone to talk to you, tell their story or hear their comment, and you're done, you write yours perfectly. But when it comes to radio, sometimes you can have, for instance, difficulties with sound. Maybe your equipment have let you down. Maybe they're broken one or another, or the quality of sound is not good enough. For instance, if you can't meet someone in person, maybe you have to use mobile phone to record a sound for mobile phone. Maybe the quality of the sound may not be great. But when you come to television, that's even more difficult because you need pictures. You need good pictures to tell your stories. And for instance, there have been cases where I had to drop a story just because I don't have pictures to do that. And particularly now, for instance, during this time of coronavirus pandemic, it's very difficult to produce stories for television. Producers have been working so hard to find very creative ways to produce because audiences need to see pictures on screen. And so what most producers, and I've tried to do that, do right now is ask our sources to record themselves and then send that to us so that we could put together the pieces. And some of these materials you receive from your sources may not be even usable for your television. So that can be difficult to produce a story. Whereas for print media, you can just pick up a phone, call them, you get their quotes, and then you have your story. So these are challenges that you can face with regards to these different medias because every media requires a different kind of material for the story to be complete.
Oh, that's a great response, and I'm reminded of we live in an era where people have learned how to communicate against these news media narratives, right? And they use social media to kind of produce counter narratives, and they, whatever their motive, at times we encounter these kinds of efforts to destabilize news organizations, to destabilize traditional journalism, in a kind of self-serving way, in a very cynical way, an approach to media. At least it's especially prevalent in recent years in the U.S. And I noticed a recent story on that was being shared. It was a national news story that was being shared. I believe it was CBS News about coronavirus, about a COVID-19 case. And one of the commenters, which just a random commenter in the forums beneath the story, was decreeing fake news, quote unquote, because they could identify the picture used in the story as being a picture used by some other source. So to them, it cried conspiracy when in fact it's a simple matter of information illiteracy.
Exactly.
Because what news organizations do, and we discount this, we don't give it enough services. They share what we refer to as B-roll, right? I mean, there's stuff that's shared because in a news setting for television, especially, you have to tell a visual story, and you need images, pictures, and so on to tell that visual story.
Yeah, and especially now, I think we're very lucky because technology has advanced so much. Television networks are now able, for instance, to record their pieces or have guests come live where guests are in very different places. I've been seeing stories, for instance, entertainment stories where you have instrument players, musicians being in different parts of the country, and then singers in different parts of the country, but they're all being linked together using Zoom, and they all appear on live television, and it sounds just beautiful considering the environment that we have. So the advantage that we have at the moment is that technology has advanced so much. So we are able to do quite a good job with limited resources and movement.
Excellent. Let me hop over to a question from Delaney, and we'll hear what she's inquiring about.
What are some difficulties of being a journalist in Tanzania?
Okay, so we've mentioned international spaces, and maybe we can hear about how context locally for you.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, in Tanzania, being a journalist now has been very, very difficult, maybe more difficult than it has ever been in the media industry here in Tanzania. We have, there are just a lot of things that makes it difficult. For instance, we have very harsh laws regarding media, the laws which control the media, and just a very small mistake, can lead you to jail. I have friends who have spent months in jail just because the authorities did not like what they reported. Personally, for instance, I've had those incidences as well, where I wrote something which the authorities did not like, and I was in trouble for that. But I have a very close friend of mine, for instance, who I had worked with, and we become quite good friends, who has disappeared now. Nobody knows where he is. It's been months now since he disappeared. And we believe it's because of his work, because he was doing investigative journalism from the area where he was coming from. So there are a lot of challenges, basic challenges regarding journalism, day-to-day challenges, but these are the biggest challenges: harsh media laws, but also life-threatening, really, situations where we are facing. So every time you produce a story which is critical to the government, you ask yourself twice, what will happen to me when this story goes on air or when this story is published? So unfortunately, it is very dangerous at the moment to be a journalist in Tanzania, something which is very sad.
I'm trying to recall which. We had a student asking specifically about those conditions. Let me just kind of continue to hear from Delaney here, and I'll see if I can kind of cue that other one up. But by all means, I think it's an opportunity, certainly where our students, at least those that, while we have many international students at MACU, it's important for students to understand that, how that sometimes our stakes are relatively lower in the U.S. and that journalism is more of an absolute calling for people and involves great risk in an effort to present information objectively, honestly, and with ethical concern. All right, here's Delaney.
Absolutely.
What advice you would give interested in human rights journalism?
Okay, yeah. So there we go. Delaney asks, what is some information you can give someone interested in human rights journalism?
I think human rights journalism is not that much different from just general journalism. I mean, the principles and the code of ethics that apply in general journalism also apply in human rights journalism. So it's not that much different, or probably it's not different at all. But I would say that there are certain qualities that you definitely would need to develop over time as you cover or as you do this human rights journalism, because you have to remember human rights journalism touches the interest of the powerful. And for instance, in the context of my country, for instance, you're talking about children who, for instance, have been exposed to chemicals in mining areas. Or maybe these chemicals in mining areas have contaminated water sources, and the whole village has been affected, cancer and stuff like that. So these are the stories that touch the interest of big companies, but in certain cases, it touches the interest of the government. So if you're not courageous, if you're not bold to do the stories, oftentimes you'll be discouraged and you stop doing that. So while human rights journalism is just like any other journalism. There are certain qualities, like I say, that eventually you would need to develop so that, to keep you going, to keep you continue doing your work. Just being, courageous, just being, consistent, and things like that, which would help you eventually to do your job well.
Okay. No. With that in mind, let me see if I can. I'm looking for where.
Hi, my name is
Rachel's questions went. They disappeared on me, but in the meantime, let's hear from Lane. Okay.
Hi, my name is Lane Smith, and I'd like to ask a couple questions. First, where do you look for inspiration for writing?
Okay, so more on the written form of journalism. What?
Right.
Talk about your inspirations.
I think that's a little different from, at least in my experience, inspirations in writing stories. I think it's a little bit different from when you're writing novels or fiction work. But for me personally, I would say most of my inspiration comes from speaking to people, and it's something that I like quite a lot. When I go out, for instance, for a drink with a group of friends, I ask them, for instance, what they've been up to or what they're working on, and through this kind of conversation, I can I get inspiration. We have, for instance, public transport here, and people are very friendly. You can, walk into a bus, have a seat, and you can start chatting with your neighbor right away, and people don't mind. And you can hear all the stories about what's happening in their neighborhoods and things like that. My coworkers, when we meet at home, at the office, and we ask them, what's happening, in their neighborhoods and things like that. So I think most of my inspiration comes from speaking to people. But of course, there are many other sources of inspiration that I get. Also through watching, listening, or reading other people's works as well. That as well has become quite a good source of my inspiration.
Sure. No, yeah. And this makes sense. Sometimes students in our major, we, as in addition to being a communication major, we cover areas of media studies and even social media studies. And sometimes students can kind of self-profess a little bit of exhaustion from some of the repetitious exercises, but just like writing, and one of the keys to excellence in writing is you don't get consistency overnight. You grow and develop through repetition. I think strategically screening certain types of media, depending on the theme, depending on the medium, and so on, is essential to that professional development. And it's not inauthentic. In fact, and we are creatures of habit, and you're describing a process where we don't do everything in isolation, is what I'm hearing, that we have to be able to kind of be out there, be engaged, and also taking in what others are doing, be alert to trends and so on.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think over the years I find myself using this question quite often. Whenever I meet someone that maybe we haven't met for a day or two, I ask them what have they been up to, or what are they working on. If I meet an artist, I'd ask them if they're doing any project, there's any project or new project they're working on, or collaboration that they're planning, things like that. I think for me, these have been quite good source of inspiration.
I've located Rachel's questions, and then I'll swing back around because I think Lane was setting up a follow-up for us.
Hello, Samuel. I hope you're doing well and staying healthy in this time. I have 3 questions for you. So the first being, what are the biggest differences between being a reporter and a producer? The second.
Okay, so can you quickly define or perhaps articulate that? Are you with us?
Yeah. I think the difference, the line sometimes can be very blur. But in my experiences, producer is someone who has helped me quite a lot to make my job as easier and as successful as possible. For instance, while my primary role would be to interview sources, to write script, to voice it or record it, and then eventually, or maybe to present it, and then maybe after I'll be mixing it together, editing, mostly radio. That's what I edit myself. So my job is could be mainly very journalistic, for instance, like interviewing, recording, mixing things, presenting, and stuff like that. Whereas with a producer is someone who would help me, for instance, to start from scratch, maybe help me with research. While as a journalist as well, I am required, and it's important for me to research for my story as much as possible. A producer also helps quite a lot with that. They ask people, maybe they check on the internet, read all newspapers and other stuff. So he or she could help a lot with researching, but also making calls, arranging for interviews, for instance. Knowing also they help quite a lot with shaping the story, like what kind of person, what kind of people should we speak to, what is the structure of the story, and things like that. So while and some producers could even help with editing story, for instance, or even editing my script. But other producers would like to let a journalist to write their own script. They can have a look at it, but also mixing or editing the audio clips or videos. Some producers would let the journalist to do that, but other producers would help on that. So I could be the one who's going on air because I've asked people and then record the interview, but a producer is someone who helped put everything together, from research to making calls to help with editing, and sometimes even sending materials or coordinating with editors. The producer is someone who would help with that. But again, it's different. This is how it works. For instance, with the BBC, but maybe other media organizations, the companies could be different.
It's that's an accurate description.
Roughly, that's kind of like. Yeah.
Let me continue with Rachel's series of questions here.
Being, can you the second being, can you describe the greatest challenge you faced while working as a foreign affairs editor?
Okay.
The last
greatest challenge or a significant challenge as a foreign affairs editor?
Right. It's interesting because
okay. We may have lost Sammy temporarily again, and like anything, that's no problem. If this were, let's talk about that producer role and what would a producer do in that instance if this were live television, right? If this were studio television, if this were a news interview, if we were on BBC, whether it's Africa or, traditional BBC, they have BBC America that, it's a UK-based news organization. You would have a producer, all the on-air talent has an earpiece in, basically, and what you see from journalists, typically when you see news journalists presenting a story, and I'm talking about like the desk hosts, they have an earpiece, they're receiving information. That information includes, and this is especially related to the producer. The producer is in their ear, they're likely giving them directions. They're directing other people at the same time, and so I think very easily we often discount the people that maybe sit. There's a shorthand that we have for those types of journalists, talking heads, right? Because when they appear on our television, they're literally a talking head. They're kind of squared off. You're typically seeing them from, a kind of like shoulders up framework, not really a profile, but in reality, it's the main newscasters are having to navigate and parcel between a lot of noise, of communication, and going through their headphones, and so that producer is a key figure that would be not just during live broadcasts, but they're overseeing aspects of story creation, of the production itself, right? Hence the term producer, which we sometimes kind of relate to the rhetor. It's like the series are going off, like all these technological AI. They hear my voice. I've asked none of them to assist me, but they can't help themselves. They're practically like interns around here. Sammy, did we get you back?
Yes, I'm back. Sorry about that.
No, that's all right. We're doing great. Yeah. And I want to jump back over to Lane and continue with his question here, if that's all right.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
For young writers, what advice would you give to them to pursue that field of work?
Okay, do you have any advice for writers?
I would say just write as much, write as much as you can. I think the best way to practice your writings, to improve your writing skills, is to write, but also read other people's work and see if you like them. Ask yourself, what did you like? What is it that you liked about it? Or if you didn't like about their work, ask yourself why you didn't like about it, and what it is that you didn't like about them. To be honest, I think I have more strength in broadcasting, that's radio and television. But I love writing, and it's something that I would really like to improve. So when it comes to writing, I'm also a student in that area. But that is something that I've learned from people that have been helping me to improve in my writing, including my wife, actually. She's a great writer, and she helps me quite a lot. And it's something that she keeps telling me that I have to be writing as much as I can. So every day, this day, I try to write at least 300 words, and I can see myself improving. When I look at the piece I wrote last year and the one that I've written now, I can see there is a massive difference. So when it comes to journalism, the principles are pretty much the same: objectivity, accuracy, fairness, and things like that. They all apply whether you're broadcasting or you're writing. But when it comes to particular skills, especially when it's writing, I think the best way to improve your skills is to write more, and then learn from others who are better, or the people that you admire.
You mentioned something that actually we don't talk about a lot in the major, but it's such a good point. It's certainly a fundamental of graduate school for many, but that this idea that while you mentioned your spouse as an accountability partner, right, as a writing partner, someone to kind of draw assistance from or influence from, it is an essential practice to have a writing group, especially if you're moving into a kind of professional writing type role, or if that's an aspiration, if that's a passion area you want to develop. Find or create a writing group, a group of fellow writers, have similar goals, and they can and you can grow through the accountability most of all, but that experience will come over time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right, and it's something that I experienced by, myself when I was in Canada, because I was in a residency, I was in a student accommodation. So, but there were people who were more experienced than myself. So usually, every once a week we would write just something short, about max 500 words, and then we'll share in advance, to each other, and then we, those who are more experience than us, they would criticize us and help us to improve more. And it will really help me quite a lot. But also, you have to have a good attitude, an attitude of accepting, constructive criticism, because that's what builds you. So you are absolutely right. I think accountability partners are very important in writing.
Your description of this fellowship or the opportunity you had to kind of spend time abroad at and near the University of Toronto. Can you maybe describe that experience a little bit more for us, and what are similarities and differences between maybe a fellowship or opportunity like that versus graduate school?
Right. So this was a fellowship that I was lucky to get based on my work. At that time, I was doing a lot of, even though I was a foreign affairs editor for this newspaper, I was also doing a lot of human rights stories. So I got that opportunity based on my work, which the kind of human rights stories I was writing about was about children's and women's rights. And I had done a lot of stories about child marriages and female circumcision, which is quite widely practiced here in Tanzania. So the opportunity was for me to go to Canada at the University of Toronto and spend a year in an academic environment. And the college that I was put, it was like a student accommodation, but for graduate students. So that's masters and PhD and other experienced writers or other lawyers and other in other fields as well. So basically, it was an opportunity for me to spend as much time as possible uninterrupted in an academic setting, where I could learn more about what I have practicing as a journalist. For instance, I did my bachelor's in mass communications, but I was writing, stories or issues to do with human rights, or I was working in an international on foreign affairs fields. But I've never, studied these two fields. So this was an opportunity for me to just audit classes. I didn't have to write any exams or anything. It was just entering classes, which I liked. And so I was able to get the academic, point of view of all these issues and stories that I had been working on as a journalist. So the difference between fellowship, at least in my experience, fellowship and graduate school, is that I was free and I had more freedom to focus on the project that I wanted to develop, or on something that I particularly wanted to learn better. In this case, I wanted to learn better about children and women's rights, especially in Africa. Whereas in graduate school, I just came back from my master's degree in the UK, where I was doing public policy. I was studying almost everything. It was so broad, I would say, in terms of public policy. So I think it's the narrow, is the the focus of studying and learning and fellowship. I think it was better than in my graduate school. I would say. I'm not sure if I'm clear on that, but I would say I had more time on my project when I was doing my fellowship than I had when I was doing my graduate school.
Yeah, excellent. Oh, thank you for kind of articulating that and kind of expounding on that for us. So we certainly have students that are at a crossroads and they're looking for what is that next appropriate stage, especially for the seniors, and some of them do consider graduate school, and some are ready to kind of move into professional situations, and it's helpful to hear about those experiences.
Hello?
You're here.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, definitely, if you have an opportunity and something that you're thinking about, I would definitely encourage a student to do this field work, working in a newsroom environment or anywhere that any kind of experience, like kind of field experience that you'd like. That, for me, was quite enriching, because then when you get an opportunity to go back into academic setting, you can match quite well the on the ground experience and what you're reading in books or hearing from professors and other fellow students. So at least in my experience, it worked quite well. I had a lot of those aha moments because then I could reflect on what I was, encountering it when I was a journalist, like on the ground, and what I'm learning. So I could relate those two experiences quite well.
Let me play a couple of questions from Emily, our student, as we're winding down here. I really will take about 10 more minutes to kind of continue this conversation. I know you have to go, and we're certainly respectful and grateful for your time. But let me jump over to Emily here.
Hi, my name is Emily Lathrop, and I have 3 questions for you. The first one is, are there any certain attributes about yourself that have changed since being a journalist?
So what has changed since you became a journalist?
That's a very good question. I was just actually discussing that with my partner. I've never thought about that actually. What is it that has changed? But then I think I've been one. First of all, I've definitely become more appreciative of what I have than I used to be, because with journalism, I get an opportunity to travel quite a lot, and I meet all kinds of people, and through meeting this this different kinds of people from all sorts of backgrounds. You meet ordinary individuals. You meet very powerful. You interview presidents and prime ministers and all these big business people. So through this interaction, I've come to really appreciate what I'm blessed with and what I have. That's definitely something that I've learned, and that has come through me traveling and meeting people or visiting different places. But I think the other thing that has definitely changed about me, I think, is the realization of the fact that the world is not black and white. I think, and this has come through me traveling through different, not just within Tanzania or just within Africa, but also in Europe and America. What is acceptable or not acceptable in my country or in my culture, I've realized is quite, the opposite in different cultures. And what is, so I've come to understand really the world is very complex. And sometimes it's important to remind oneself that it's not black and white. And it's good to appreciate the diversities between people and between cultures. I hope I've answered your question. It's a bit of a difficult question, maybe.
I think it was. We had a bit.
Probably people who have known me for many years would have understood, would have said better about that. But yeah.
Here we go.
The second one is, what is your process in conducting interviews as a reporter?
Talk to us a little bit about your process as a reporter.
First of all, when it comes to interviews, research is very important. That's something I cannot stress enough. Research. That's something that's really important. So the first thing I do is research better about the person that I'm going to interview, but also about the subject that we're going to discuss, because it is through this research that you learn better about them, and then you can come up with more informed questions, and that will help your report to come out great. So after researching, I think the rest of the process are just very basic, I would say. For instance, setting appointments, agreeing on time that you're going to meet and place and things like that. So that's very basic. But the other thing is making sure that your equipments are working right. You have your batteries and they're good. They still have power. You have equipment. Your equipments are not broken. You would think this is very small things, maybe relevant, but trust me, one day I recorded about 4-hour interview with the cyclist, the enthusiast in Dar es Salaam, only to realize that the batteries in my microphone were dead. So I got back to the office and tried to put the audio clip on my computer, and I had no material on my computer. It was painful. I regretted that very much. So after you've researched, set up your interview well and nice, then make sure all your equipment are working. They're good. Also, if you can, after you've interviewed someone, after you finish the interview, try to see if you really have that material. Because sometimes maybe you have traveled to a different town or different, and then maybe it's not easy for you to go there, to go back and record that. So you have to make sure you really have that material so that when you go back, you have that. I think sometimes it's difficult to say the exact process which applies in all kinds of interviews, but absolutely research, make sure your equipments are fine, show up on time, just give yourself enough time to be there on time, 5 minutes, 10 minutes before, or even 30 minutes, and then continue with the interview. And then after you've done that, check you have everything with you. And yeah, I think these are things that I tend to do almost all the time that I do my interviews.
Oh, that is excellent. I believe not only Emily, but Rachel and some others had a question asking about challenges you faced in various roles, but you've done an excellent job of really weaving in that response into some of yours. If we can, let me jump to a final question from Kelsey, if it's the question I'm thinking of, a nice kind of way to close out this discussion, and we can kind of wrap things up and allow you to rejoin your other professional duties. But let's hear from Kelsey here.
And what are some goals you are hoping to achieve in your career? Thank you.
Well, that is the question that I think I still ask myself. The goal, you see, my goal, I think the biggest goal, I think, in my profession is just to continue doing this, continue to cover as many stories as possible. It's different because when I started, I had different goals. I felt like when I'm an editor, maybe for a newspaper or something, that would be the most satisfying achievement that I'll have as a journalist. But I continue to be in this field. I find myself actually the things that satisfy me. One of the things that satisfy me the most is just telling stories. Meeting more people, continue to telling more stories which I believe they're important. Continue telling more stories which maybe others are not able to do. So, to be honest, maybe I haven't formed that one single goal that I want to achieve by the end, maybe a tangible goal that I want to achieve by the end of my career. But I think for me, at the moment, so far, I still just want to continue telling stories. That's my goal. As long as I'm in this field. Yeah.
That's a fantastic response, and a perfect place for us to kind of pause this conversation for now to kind of formally close our interview time together. I want to thank you again so much for joining us, in these unique times, unique circumstances where many of us are troubleshooting from home. All of our universities in the U.S. are closed for the most part, operating, off-site, away from campus. Yeah. It's posing unique challenges, and certainly, you have your own, and you would have experienced many of these types of coordinating hurdles as a journalist yourself over the years. Can't thank you enough for joining us, and hopefully we'll be able to connect again in the future.
Absolutely. Well, I want to say thank you so much for inviting me and welcoming me to share my story with you. I'm sorry, maybe we couldn't answer all the questions because of time, But also, maybe I didn't answer some of the questions in a way that you expected, but I really enjoyed speaking to you very much. Maybe next time we'll have better, connection, and we can see each other through video. But I want to say thank you so much. It's my pleasure really to share my experiences with you. My email, you have my email, Professor Kasperi. So if you have any questions, please share with me anytime. I'm happy to share my experience as much as I can.
Excellent. Well, thank you again, Semi Awami, for joining us. Exciting work that you're doing, important work that you're doing for our students in the class, for our audience. Thank you all for your quick turnaround this week to help us coordinate and communicate with our guest interviewee. And we'll look forward to future information as we move closer to wrapping up this course. And I'll be in touch with those details in the coming days. All right. Thank you for listening.